Are you ready to gamble? This deck is a chaotic masterpiece that can take control of the game in so many unpredictable ways. If you have been wanting a new and interesting way to spice up your gameplay, then this deck is exactly what you need. So welcome to Power Budget TCG. My name is Cody, and today we're looking at Atla Palani Nest Tender. She costs 1 generic, a red, a green, and a white for a 2/3 legendary creature human shaman with 2 tap, create a 0/1 green egg creature token with Defender, and whenever an egg you control dies, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. In this deck, she is the core of our value engine. We do have her make eggs, and we want to use those eggs to search for some other more useful creatures. There are 2 main types of creatures that we will get out of this deck as well. Those are big creatures that would normally be prohibitively expensive, or we can get creatures that help us get those creatures. I like to call her Atla Palani Creature Casino because she ends up just being a full-on gamble. And the fun does come from the bated breath as the table watches and sees if you end up hitting a Blossom Dryad, or if you cheat your way into a brand spanking new Titanoth Rex. So let's get into this deck and talk about the cards that make it really fun. Majority of it comes from the large fellas that we get to put onto the battlefield without needing to really pay for them. Some of the best cards we have in this deck are creatures that have a cost of 7 or more mana that normally would be an absolute investment. But in this deck, it ends up being a surprise to everyone in the game. Some of the most impactful creatures that you can see are the things like Giant Adaphage. For 5 generic and 2 green, you get a 7/7 creature insect with trample, and whenever Giant Adaphage deals combat damage to a player, create a token that's a copy of Giant Adaphage. This guy pulls the attention of all people on the board. If this even gets a single trample damage through, you get to create another copy of it and put it onto the battlefield. Then those copies get the chance to make more copies as well, and that can easily get out of hand, and honestly, if it doesn't get wiped, usually it can lead to a quick win. Another fun one is Collar of the Pack. It is 5 generic and 2 green for an 8/6 creature beast with trample and myriad. And for those of you who don't know what myriad is, it's an ability that when a creature attacks, it creates a token for each other player that's not attacking, and those tokens are attacking each of those other players, and then they get exiled at end of combat. So each opponent is getting a collar, one of which is the real one. This brings down a ton of damage, and most people won't even block most of the damage since they're tokens, and it's not even worth trading for. And for the protection, we run a couple of cards. The first one is Spearbreaker Behemoth. For 5 green, you get a 5/5 creature beast with indestructible, and pay 1, target creature with power 5 or greater gains indestructible until end of turn. A lot of your creatures end up meeting that requirement, and they do benefit from that protection greatly. And you can skirt a huge board wipe or keep one of your big creatures from dying to kill spells or other damage/destroy effects. The second one is Dawnglade Regent. For 5 green, you can get an 8/8 creature elk with when Dawnglade Regent enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. And as long as you are the monarch, permanents you control have hexproof. This here is one of the best ways to protect your board. Most of your big boys get a lot of targeted hate, and Dawnglade can just stop all of that before they get a chance to. It can be really difficult to run this deck if all your stuff keeps taking 3 players' decks worth of removal at every given opportunity, so this really helps keep your board alive, and they don't have a choice but to try and stop you by blocks. So let's make them block some creatures, and ones that are too shiny not to block, with everything. Those creatures would be things like Breaker of Armies, an 8 generic for a 10/8 creature Eldrazi that says all creatures able to block Breaker of Armies do so. This means that if you were to end up with a board that has a lot of non-trample creatures, you can get almost an entirely unblockable team in on damage and kill all of the creatures with a total toughness 10 or less that you need to. Usually these creatures do die in combat, so go ahead and find creatures like Treeshaker Chimera. For 5 generic and 2 green, you get an 8/5 creature Chimera with all creatures able to block Treeshaker Chimera do so. And when Treeshaker Chimera dies, draw 3 cards. Now when you take their life, they won't have much of a choice but to sacrifice a lot of their creatures and let you draw 3 cards. Let's talk about the other creatures we will probably see in this deck, and you'll see why this got the name Creature Casino, because we'll be seeing a bunch of other creatures with a similar effect to Blossom Dryad. This costs 2 and a green for a 2/2 creature Dryad with tap, untap target land. This type of ramp ends up being the best for us in the deck since we will be using a bunch of enchantments that do a similar thing to Wild Growth. For a single green, you can get an enchantment aura with Enchant Land, and whenever Enchanted Land is tapped for mana, it produces an additional green. The wording of this allows a single land to tap for more and more mana. It is specifically different from Find the Path, which is also in this deck. Find the Path costs 2 generic and a green for an enchantment aura with Enchant Land, and when Find the Path enters the battlefield, venture into the dungeon. That doesn't matter too much. And then lastly, Enchanted Land has tap, add green, green. This is different because with Find the Path, the land is gaining the ability to tap for 2 mana. But if we put another thing like Find the Path on the land, it still is only able to tap for 2 mana. But when Wild Growth goes on a land, it will add a mana on top of what was made. So if you were to put 5 Wild Growth type effects onto a land, it'll tap for whatever mana it makes and 5 additional green. That's where this land ramp gets really broken. So if you see the enchantment ramp that gives lands abilities, put it on separate lands. But when you see a card like Wild Growth or Market Festival, which is a 3 generic and 1 green enchantment, or with Enchant Land, whenever enchanted land is tapped for mana, its controller adds 2 mana of any combination of colors to his or her mana pool, you can put it on your land and have it tap for like 5 mana. And then when you get the creature like Blossom Dryad, it now taps for 10 essentially. And each creature you get after that does a Blossom Dryad effect, like Portent Tracker, a 1 and a green 1/1 creature Satyr Scout with tap, untap target land, and tap, choose target battle. If an opponent protects it, remove a defense counter from it, otherwise put a defense counter on it. Activate only as a sorcery. It does what we want, and it just gets added benefit for being able to mess with battles. And if an opponent has the audacity to put a battle on you, the one with the scariest creatures, they'll then also have to deal with the fact that you can now buff the counters on it if you wanted to. The reason this deck chooses this kind of ramp is because when we draw cards, we will still eventually need to hard cast these creatures. And with these creatures, you usually never have a problem casting anything out of your hand. Just one land that taps for 4 mana can get you an absurd amount of mana with just even one creature that untaps a land you control. Now, we are allowed to make 1 egg per turn cycle, and since they're 0/1 green eggs with Defender, we either have to hold them up for blockers, or we can sacrifice them for extra value and pop the creatures at instant speed. Some of the best options we have for sacrificing our eggs are things like Culling Die. For just 2 generic, you can get an artifact with tap, sacrifice a creature, put a charge counter on Culling Die. 1, sacrifice Culling Die, draw a card for each charge counter on Culling Die. This is great for us since we only need to sacrifice usually 1 creature at instant speed per turn cycle, and when we find another sack outlet or just need the card draw, it can be sacrificed itself to refill our hand. It gains a lot of incremental value over time, and it is an all-star in this deck. Or you can just use a card like Relic File. For just 3 generic, you can get an artifact with 2, tap, sacrifice a creature, draw a card. The second part isn't really important, but it does read as long as you control a cleric, Relic Vial has whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This allows you to sacrifice a creature and draw for it. You will flip for a creature first since the death of the egg is a part of the activation cost, but you still get to draw a card by the end of it regardless. You could also get a Greater Gargadon. For 9 and a red, you can get a 9/7 creature beast with suspend 10 for 1 red, which means if you end up paying, it'll put it into exile for 10 time counters, and then when you remove the last time counter, cast it without paying its mana cost. You remove those time counters at the beginning of your upkeep, so whatever. And it also gains haste until end of turn. It says sacrifice an artifact, creature, or land. Remove a time counter from Greater Gargadon. Activate only if Greater Gargadon is suspended. This runs you twofold in your deck. If you see it in your hand, you end up having 1 mana sack outlet that eventually becomes a threat in a maximum of 10 turns, or you flip it into almost a vanilla 9/7 and add it to the list of fun beaters. But with all these creatures, your opponents will still end up getting really scared and will probably try and stop your game plan as soon as possible. So there are a few options I've included to make their lives miserable. First, let's have a game plan for if they use that absolute salt mine of a card that is Farewell. The only real option I have for it is Semester's End. For a 3 and a white, you get an instant with exile any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers you control at the beginning of the next end step. Return each of them to the battlefield under its owner's control, and each of them enters the battlefield with an additional 1/1 counter if it's a creature and an additional loyalty counter on it if it's a planeswalker. This slow flicker type effect is useful so that the main board gets out of the way for the stack, and then once it resolves, they all come back a little bit better than before. But if they are going to board wipe and it's only a destroy effect, well then let's roll these slots, baby. Let's cast a Shields of I don't know how to pronounce that. Let's try it again. Let's cast a Shields of Velis Vel. For 1 white, you get a tribal instant shapeshifter with Changeling, so it counts as casting a spell of that creature type, if that matters. Creatures target player controls get +0/+1 and gain all creature types until end of turn. This means all your creatures get to roll the slots. once they all die, they just come right back as new creatures. So you end up with the same size of a board state that your opponents were scared of, and then they still lose their creatures. If you end up having that relic vial out and this happens, now each of your creatures are also clerics. So each creature dying ends up making each opponent lose a life and you gain a life. Huh. Volatile Claws is a 2 and a red instant. Until on a turn, creatures you control get +2/0 and gain all creature types. If you really need the damage, you can obviously cast it just to get that +2/0 buff, but for the most part, holding this to respond to a board wipe is honestly the most impactful use of this card. You can also make all of your creatures all creature types by using Mirror Entity. For 2 and a white, you get a 1/1 creature shapeshifter with Changeling, and pay X. Until end of turn, creatures you control have base power and toughness XX and gain all creature types. So if you don't have one of these effects in hand, you can sacrifice an egg to try and roll for a Mirror Entity. Gotta get those slots, baby. And for just 1 mana, you can make each creature just any creature type. And if you really want to, you could also use your Mega Enchanted Land to tap for double-digit mana and use Mirror Entity as a finisher. Finally, we're gonna get to our lands. For the basics, it's 14 forests, 9 mountains, and 9 plains. That'll make up the majority of our base. It is also usually a good idea for you to put the enchantments that you end up ramping with on a basic land, since a lot of the happenstance land destruction uses the clause to destroy non-basic land, so this would help prevent most people from just popping your mana on a whim. But we still do run non-basic lands, like Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. They're both lands that say tap, sack it, search your library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. There are also lands like Fortified Village and Game Trail. Each have an ETB that will tap that land down if it's played, unless you reveal a land that has the basic land type of one of the types that it can tap for. So for Game Trail, you need to reveal a mountain or a forest, and for Fortified Village, you need to reveal a forest or a plains. Jungle Shrine can also tap for any one of the 3 colors that this commander uses, but it does enter the battlefield tapped. And then finally, Mosswort Bridge. It has Hideaway, so it will enter tapped, but when it does, you can look at the top 4 cards of your library, exile one of them face down, and then put the rest onto the bottom of your library. It can tap for a green, and it does have pay a green, tap it. You may play the exile card without paying its mana cost if creatures you control have total power 10 or greater. You will pretty much easily meet that requirement, so just pack whatever you want out of there and then cast it whenever you need to. Don't forget that you have it down there. A lot of people end up forgetting that they have it down there, but it also does need to stay within the same... No, it doesn't, does it? I'm gonna look something up. That's actually really interesting. Can you do that at instant speed? You may play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Oh, so you can put lands under it. Oh, yeah. Okay. You wanna know what I learned? If you put a land underneath of it, you can't play it on your opponent's turns, but no matter what else you put underneath of it, you can cast that at instant speed. So if it ends up being a sorcery, you can cast it at instant speed as long as you have total creature power 10 or greater at that time. Who would have thunk it? Anyway, magic is weird. I'm glad that this is the thing. Also, you like this? I have a teleprompter. I don't know if you can tell, but like, this is super useful. This is like really useful. That wraps up the look into this deck. If you want to see some more, or you know a friend who would love to build this deck, you could absolutely share this video or send them the deck list in the description down below. This one is a little bit more expensive than usual, coming to $13.18, so I understand if you want to instead just buy 1/4 of a single Cavern of Souls. I do have a special spot in my heart because this is the first time I ever built a deck with this restriction in mind. This is not the first iteration that I've ever done with this, but this was like the thing that sparked it off, because it started off and it was actually a lot worse, but slowly and surely I made little changes here and there, took out a lot of creatures that tried to untap creatures, for example, that ended up not working out well. It's the reason I have an entire interest in building a lot of these 50 cents or less decks, because this deck ran so well and it was so much fun to play. And now here we are. So just let me know what you think of this deck, and let me know what you would want to see from me next. I've already built a bunch of decks. It's just a matter of writing a script and recording and editing. And so, hey, what is your favorite way to play Magic? Do you prefer Commander, or do you find yourself mostly playing in things like Modern or Standard? I obviously play a lot of Commander, but if y'all are interested, I'll build some Modern or Standard decks, or Pioneer, or whatever. Anyway, this has been Power Budget TCG, and I'll see you later. Peace out.